Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. You can see I've got a bin out here on the bench. I got my glove on. But before we get started, I thought I'd really quick give you guys a quick orientation as to what my game plan here for today is. And as usual, in my mind, a picture tells 1,000 words. So really quick, what you see out here on the bench is what I'm referring to as sort of a cocoon nursery. And for me, a cocoon nursery usually just means it's a bunch of finished castings in which I had spotted cocoons. And the time is given for the cocoons to hatch, the babies to emerge, and then before this is really treated as a finished batch of castings, try to round up those worms. So the bin that we're looking at here on the bench is actually depicted down here, and it's really the castings that came out of 3 separate harvested worm bins, red wiggler worm bins. That's the reason it's almost full. This is actually one of my larger size containers, but it is almost full and it is quite heavy. And we've already had a couple occasions of trying to get worms out of here. So on 2 occasions now, we've done haul outs of worms from here. And the last one was 16 days ago. And we've actually been populating my very newest bin, which is now 27 days old, with only hauled out worms from this system here. And now on 2 occasions, we've come up with a total of 716 worms occupying my newest bin. And my newest bin is buddied up with the second newest bin, both red wiggler systems. You can see that the slightly older one has got a significantly larger population in it. But we're going to see what we can do about changing that today, because after 16 days, I'm thinking that this system's probably ready for another haul out. And who knows, maybe at this point, maybe all the worms have collected in the bait boxes that I had put out there for them. And maybe this can actually be treated as a batch of finished castings now. And I guess just on a side there, the 2 systems that make up the majority of the castings in here, the worms that came out of those 2 systems, went over to some breeder buckets that I've got off on the side, but I've not been maintaining video updates about that system, or those systems, I guess, if you want to treat them as separate systems. I've really been treating that as sort of a side project. And who knows, maybe at some point they'll come back online as far as, you know, making a presence on my channel. But to me that just seems like, I don't know, most people just weren't really that fond of videos pertaining to those buckets. So I figured if I'm going to be doing work in those buckets, then it would just be kind of offline work. So now, one thing I did do in here, I think it might have been 8 days ago, I did drop a few extra pieces of food in here, a few chunks of pumpkin. I think I even sprinkled some leaves in here. And I have been checking in periodically to just give each of these a little squirt of water just to keep them nice and moist and comfortable. So let's just set these aside really quick. We'll take a closer look at what's in them. Hopefully we've collected a good number of worms. But now one thing we did last time to try to motivate the worms to exit the finished castings was we did give the whole container a good stir. And the whole idea of doing that was to take any of the dry stuff that had been out here on the surface and blend it in with the rest of the material in the system in order to introduce that nice dry material down into the more moist stuff, in the hopes that the material in general throughout the bin would just become somewhat drier and possibly dry enough to motivate the worms to go seek out a more comfortable place to be. And a lot of times it's usually right around the bait box that you find worms still occupying the castings. And I think last time too we started just fishing them out individually, one by one. And that's obviously an impractical way to try to separate worms from their castings. But we did do a little bit of that for a while. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe this is already a completely evacuated batch of castings. Let's check in the vicinity of this other bait box where this one was submerged into the castings. I would think it has to be around the bait boxes where the material is still a little bit more damp, since I was applying moisture to the bait boxes, but all the rest of the material in this bin has been just left out here to dry, you know. But since this is castings and since it is pretty deep, my guess was that the material down low is probably still damp enough to keep worms interested in staying in it. Or maybe not. I really don't know, you know, because I didn't really get a chance to see how the mixing of the dry stuff off the top surface down into the more damp stuff that we pulled out from the bottom had, you know, turned out in terms of the overall dampness of the material throughout the bin. So I did find one worm and I just threw him into one of these bait boxes, and you know, it's hard to say where that one worm came from. I'll try to do a couple more deep dive tilling turnovers of the lower ends of the bin here to see if possibly down low I might still have a little pocket of moisture where maybe another worm or two are hanging out, but it does almost seem to me like this stuff is completely devoid of worms at this point. Yeah, very nice. I was wondering what might be going on in here, you know, since it's been sitting here for over 2 weeks now without me even taking a look, you know, other than adding pumpkin and moisture to the bait boxes. I've not, you know, tried tilling around the material or examining it. Now I did actually find 2 more worms here. 2 more worms, 3, okay, 3 worms total so far. And it's really making me question whether or not I would want to try to reset bait boxes and try to keep rounding up worms if all we're talking about is just a handful of worms. So let's make it official today. This is now a done deal. This is a finished batch of castings. Here's another worm. Doesn't look very lively. Hopefully still alive. I'm going to drop it in there with the other ones. But I think the fact that we stumbled on, you know, 5 or 6 worms in here, I think it's safe to say that we're done, you know. I'm not going to set up bait boxes just to try to round up a handful of worms. I'm afraid that if those poor little worms find it to be a little bit too dry in here, then that's just going to be the end of them, unfortunately. But there's always going to be a little bit of collateral damage when you're worm farming. So I'm going to set this aside, and at some point I'll be able to move it off into buckets, clean out the bin, make it ready for use for another mission. But as far as the baiting of the worms out of this cocoon nursery, I think we're done. Now we get to see how many worms we rounded up, and then we'll release them into their new home. So let me get this thing out of our way, and we'll continue with checking out the collected worms in the bait boxes. Okay, so I guess the easiest way to do this is to simply drop the contents out and see what we've got. I can see down here within the container a few worms. Not sure how easy it is to see them since the lighting is not optimal for this sort of a scenario here, but it does seem like we're gonna have to fish these little guys out somehow. Let's also see what we could do about emptying this other one. I'm trying to remember how I managed to get the worms out of these last time. I think I might have used some sort of a tool, some sort of a little probe or something to try fishing them out. I wonder what I can use to accomplish that. Well, you know, for now, let's just see what we could see over here. I'm thinking, since I did bring down some food, since we're going to move over to the newest of my bins to feed them, I figured perhaps we can make a little platform over here to get what I'm working on a little bit closer to the camera's eye. And, well, I think what we're going to do first is just examine this pile of mush. This would be a combination of newspaper chunks, some recycled bits of pumpkin that had been used from the very beginning when we first started baiting worms out of these systems, or out of this system. And then those couple other pieces of freshly added pumpkin. And I guess it's nice to see that there's a good bit of moisture still lingering within this stuff here. And what appears to be a pretty decent number of worms that have come together. Some of them are pretty small in size. Some of them are a little bit larger. Regrettably, we can't really get a very good view of how many there are exactly. But here and there, when you take a closer look at just a handful of stuff, you'll see a medium-sized worm, a small-sized worm, another small-sized worm, perhaps flip it over, perhaps unfold a little bit. Try to see what sort of worm activity is in between the folds of these pieces of bedding. And at some point, before we release these into the newest of my bins over there, we're going to see what we could do about coming up with some sort of a rough estimate as far as how many worms came together for this last haul out from the cocoon nursery. And I think I'm already starting to formulate some sort of a number in my head just based on what I'm seeing here. And obviously it's very much a guesstimate, you know, because there's no way to really see all of them. They're kind of all over the place, nested within folds of this paper, possibly burrowed into chunks of the food remaining. So there's really no easy way to see them all. But I think we've got to get these little guys out of here. I'm going to get a probe. I've got a little piece of stick. Not even sure if you can call it a stick. It's more like just the end of like a shish kebab stick. I guess it is a stick. And I'm trying to do this pretty gently so that I'm not going to injure any little wormies in the process here. I'm actually just trying to dislodge the castings material that's sort of adhered to the corners of the container and push the worms around with that stuff that's on the tip of the tool that I'm using here. So I think I've got a few that I've managed to pull out of this box here. There's a couple more right down here. And it seems like we've got one over here trying to get out the back door. Let's see if there's any others like that. Any's on the bottom? No, none in this stuff over here. Just try to scrape off these castings a little bit better and do another quick dislodging of the remaining castings material that I see down in here. But I see no more worms. So we're going to treat bait box number 1 as being emptied and depopulated of wormies. Let's see what we can do about removing worms from this other one here. Here I see only a couple that are perhaps a little bit bigger in size. Oh, and a few that are very, very tiny. So I mean, since this was a cocoon nursery and since it's only been around for a couple months, you know, I assume that we're dealing mainly with baby or juvenile worms. Although, you know, those other 2 bins that I showed on the diagram earlier, those were harvested in such a way that I don't think I was very thorough in the rounding up of the worms to release into my into those breeder buckets. So in the case of the castings that came out of those 2, I felt like I had a lot of straggler worms that ended up in the castings. So besides trying to haul out babies that were born from the cocoons in that cocoon nursery, I also felt like we were also rounding up stragglers that we failed to collect in the harvest of the second 2 containers. So now I've got another worm hanging out right here on my pinky finger and no more on my glove. So what we have here is haul out number 3, and it's kind of nice when you finally put a kind of a period at the end of the sentence, so to speak, right, to bring an end to a system, to really see its mission accomplished, and then kind of opening the door to getting the material out of that container and put over into storage and getting that stuff ready for the upcoming gardening season. So these little guys, they're going to get into the younger of the 2 bins that I've got off on the side. So the next step is going to be getting them out here for their feeding. And besides the coffee I showed you a moment ago, which is a part of what they're going to be fed, I've also got kind of an unusual thing over here that they're going to be fed in addition to the coffee. And that is what you see right here. And I was having a little bit of difficulty earlier trying to make another batch of my worm chow. The little personal blender device that I use died, unfortunately. And this was the stuff that just did not get ground up. Luckily, I was able to, complete almost an entire container full of worm chow. But what ended up not getting ground down to a fine enough consistency is in here. And I think most of what's in here is going to be chunks of dried out elbow noodles, little bits of broken up rice that didn't break down quite enough in the grinding process. And then there was some bird seed, a couple pumpkin seeds thrown in here. But none of this really became fine enough to kind of pass my quality control. Here too, I ran all of this through a kitchen strainer to make sure that I was only capturing the most fine material here. And all of this stuff, I'm assuming once it gets hydrated down within a worm bin, all the noodles in here, all the rice in here, all this stuff is going to end up becoming yummy food for the worms. Just needs a little bit of moisture. So let's go ahead and get those other bins out here, the ones we're feeding today. And let me get rid of these too. Onward. Alright, so traditionally I always start buddy bins with the older of the two. So we'll get to the younger one, the one that we're going to release the collected worms into next. But let's really quick take care of giving these guys their coffee / worm chow-ish combination meal. And it's only been 8 days, I believe, since we last checked in on this system to feed them. So there might be leftovers. But it just seemed sensible to, to go ahead and feed them as long as one of the bins was going to be pulled out to release worms into. And since what I've got for them isn't a whole lot anyway, it kind of works out well. Here's a pumpkin seed. You can see a few worms out here near the surface. And one thing we've been doing in all my bins, oh, that's interesting. It's been 8 days, so I don't know, I guess my one observation was how things felt a little bit warm down here. Not hot or anything like that, but just a little bit warmer than usual. And I guess my interval between feedings is usually a little bit more than just 8 days, so maybe I'm actually getting back in here early enough to actually sensing a little bit of the heating up of the foods that can be placed into a worm bin, because it's something I normally don't ever experience. I never really check in my bins. I feed them and then I only get back to them the next time they're due for another feeding. So I'm not even sure what's really causing the warmth. Maybe it's just a whole bunch of worms bumping up against each other. So what we ended up doing in here last time we checked in 8 days ago was we included a kind of a novelty item. So we went back into the process of attempting to compost fabrics, and in this case this is cotton. It's just a piece of terry cloth beach towel. And in the past I've actually already composted some of this colorful beach towel, and I put some in this one as well into the other younger buddy bin. So each of them got a piece of that same towel, and it'll be interesting to watch how the worms gradually work it down. Interesting how some of the leaves down here that we put in as bedding material are still a little bit dry. So some of the other bedding materials we're spotting down here are maybe like a coffee filter here. This is a piece of cantaloupe rind. This is the seed out of an avocado, probably still too fresh to be busted, which means there's probably also some skin of an avocado floating around. And I think the main event last time we fed was apple peels. And somehow apple in general in my mind always seems like it's a material that's going to go kind of slow in the worm bins. But since it was only apple peel, my thinking was that perhaps it will go a little bit quicker than normal. So here and there we're seeing a good number of worms hanging out. I guess the stuff I'm going to push off on this side is going to be bedding only. If I find sheets of paper or pieces of food leftovers, I'll put them on the other side. And we'll see what we could do about using all this stuff over here down in the feeding area to keep it kind of where the action is. So this avocado still has a good amount of leftover food stuck to it. Here's another chunk of the cantaloupe melon rind. Man, good number of worms still working on that thing. I believe when we checked in here 8 days ago, this piece still had a good bit of melon stuck to the rind, whereas the other one had already been stripped quite clean of any of the melon. I guess everything else I'm seeing down here appears to be, for the most part, castings. No, we've still got a little bit more avocado here. And here we go. This is what I was curious of. We got a couple mango seeds, one in each system. And they've so far not been soft enough or pliable enough to be able to open them up. And who knows, by this time it might have just opened up on its own or whatever, but I figured if it's possible I would try to give it a little squeeze and see if I can possibly crack it open and give the worms access to the insides of it. But I really don't want to go crazy with it. If it wasn't going to happen, it wasn't going to happen, and right there I just couldn't really get it to happen, so we'll just let it continue on its own, and at some point in the near future we should be able to breach it for the worms and let them in if they haven't already managed to let themselves in. So we got a good bit of leftover material here, and a good bit of material with which we can kind of cover up here too. This is the stem of a pumpkin. There's all kinds of interesting stuff down in here. I guess the only reason I'm going out of my way to really excavate this feeding area so thoroughly is because I'd really like to see about adding a handful or two of fresh bedding to kind of stick to that whole idea of enhancing the bedding in each system to the point where I kind of maximize the available space in each system so that all my systems are running close, if not at capacity. This is a cork. And I mean, I didn't really build any of these newer of my systems in such a way that they were already kind of at the container's capacity. So we'll have to sort of build our way up to that. Let me just grab my supply of prepared bedding here, which I replenished the other day. So what am I trying to say? I don't know. I guess I could very well create a whole bunch of bedding material and make a direct effort to really maximize the capacity of every one of my systems, but then I'd be out of prepared bedding, you know. So even though I've got a good supply of it here, I want to have enough on hand to tend to my other systems too as I get around to feeding almost on a daily basis around here. So if I really wanted to do that, I would have to kind of treat it as a special project and make sure I've prepared sufficient bedding to get the project completed. So for now I'm really just going to kind of stick to trying to drive towards that aim without necessarily achieving it. And you know, these top covering pieces of newspaper, I don't think that they're really in good shape anymore to be treated as top covering, so we'll just use them as supplemental bedding down in the feeding area too. And even this piece of coffee filter here, which would have been our feeding zone indicator, I guess we could even go ahead and include that as supplementary bedding down in the feeding, because you know, we've got ourselves a nice replacement coffee filter once we give them that coffee portion that I bought down for them, and we'll be able to replace the old feeding zone indicator. Alright, so we've spread out a lot of this recycled paper pretty nicely so that we could sprinkle in the food that we bought down for them onto it, hopefully making it into a really interesting place for the worms to hang out and check on. So let's grab one of these 2 days worth of coffee so we can plop it down here into the feeding area. This will become the replacement feeding zone indicator for this bin. Let's spread it out. When it's time to put the coffee in, I usually go for my nice worm chow to kind of spice up the feeding area's coffee supply. But in this case, I think we're going to go with this mix of cooked rice, cooked noodles, broken up pretty nicely into small little bits, but perhaps not broken up quite as thoroughly as I would have liked for it to be considered as worm chow. And my hope is that by being down here, it's all damp enough so that the stuff gets kind of rehydrated, and then it's just going to be a whole bunch of yummy soft noodle bits, nice soft rice, all kinds of stuff that the worms should really enjoy nibbling on. And back in goes our little experimental piece of cotton fabric. All right, so let's see. I'm gonna kind of come over here and use this as an excuse to dig down deep out on the very edge so that almost the entire contents of the container will have benefited from being aerated. And then we also just get to make sure stuff out there is in good shape. Since the feeding zone is usually in the middle, it gets all the attention, but I try to make an extra effort to make sure I examine the outer edges of the bins too, to make sure I'm not neglecting parts of the bin that could possibly get dry or get problematic. And then by not having checked in on it regularly, I'd feel kind of responsible for letting it get that way. So just feel like I want to keep tabs on how things are doing in these systems by usually checking the outer edges too when I'm in here, you know, visiting in on the bins. And man, over this side, things are so much more damp for whatever reason. I don't know why. And it seems like the worms are really out here in great numbers because of that moisture. So that's kind of interesting. I guess maybe I'm going to move some of this more damp material that I just excavated over to this opposite edge. And then I think we can start to level stuff off here. I tell you, this system seems kind of nice. There's all kinds of interesting bedding floating around in here. There's leaves, there's large chunks of cardboard and paper and coffee filters and shredded paper. There's all kinds of food floating around, but I think we've managed to get the majority of the food items right down into the middle of the bin, where all the freshly added coffee and worm chow-ish material was added. So let's get these little guys covered up and get the younger bin out here so that we can get that system fed and we can get the rounded up worms hauled out of the cocoon nursery released as well. Alright, on to the newer bin. Alright. These buddy bins, usually very similar, but I guess the main difference here is the fact that this system has only 700 some odd worms versus the other system having 1600 some odd worms, probably closer to 1700 in the other system. So here's the feeding zone indicator that we put in here last time, but we could use this as sort of supplemental bedding down the feeding too. And I guess that top covering newspaper will come back on. The other system regrettably doesn't have one. You know, let's do a quick exploration of the outer edges really quick out here, just to make sure things are okay. Out here I'm not seeing a whole lot of worm activity, but then again comparing this to the other bin, even though they're buddy bins, might not be completely realistic, at least not yet, since there's far fewer worms inhabiting this system. So hopefully the explanation for why they're not over on this side like they were in the other bin is that they're down in the feeding area. Let's do a quick till out on this edge too, see how things look. Just seems so weird to like be, you know, going through a big couple handfuls of material and seeing virtually no worms in it. I mean, I see one or two, and you know, all the way down at the bottom. Some of them are kind of camouflaged. If I look carefully, I could see them, but not, you know, otherwise I probably would have, you know, missed them. Here and there's like chunks of cardboard like this that are really kind of big and kind of wadded together. See what I could do about fragmenting them a little bit when I encounter them. But, you know, I don't think it's a big deal. I think the main explanation for why we're seeing so few worms is mainly because it's a pretty sparsely populated system. And hopefully by exploring the feeding zone, we'll get a chance to actually see the worms that inhabit the bin. So let's dig in and see what we got. Yep. A lot of dry leafy material like we saw in the other system, which I think would benefit from just being blended in with the surrounding materials. Here and there I'm seeing little pockets of worms. Here we go. There they all are. They must have just come out to check out the foods. Here too we've got cantaloupe rind, avocado bits. So over the past few feedings, since they've been buddied up, they've been getting very similar food items. So we should be able to kind of anticipate what sort of leftovers we should find down here when we excavate. And I am kind of glad to see that the apple peel that I was sort of expecting to find in great quantities as leftovers has for the most part been nibbled away. I mean, here's a piece of it right here. And this piece actually has a pretty good amount of apple stuck to the skin still. And this bin might have a little bit more of that left over because it is a more sparsely populated system, but it was nice in the other bin at least to see how they had actually done away with a good bit of it. So very nice. Let's get this out of the way so we can really complete our examination of this feeding area. Here's the mango seed that this system got. And there's a little bit of give, you know, when I try to squeeze on it, but I don't want to go too crazy trying. If it doesn't want to give right away, we're just going to put it back and let it continue. And I think there's a definite benefit to blending in all this dry, leafy stuff in with the surrounding materials. Because as long as it just sits there dry, it doesn't really interest the worms and gets no attention. So as long as it's surrounded by damp materials, it actually has a chance to get broken down versus just sitting there. Alright, here too, I don't know if we have to go quite as big since there's a somewhat smaller population living in here. We'll follow suit by trying to build out the bin a little bit with some supplementary bedding, but perhaps not quite as much as we did in the other system. And since we've got a replacement coffee filter to deploy as the feeding zone indicator in here, we'll recycle the old one down in the feeding area. So back in can go the leftover avocado, the leftover mango seed, leftover cantaloupe rind, and what other kinds of leftovers did we encounter? Not a whole hell of a lot. Which is nice to see. That's kind of what you're after, right? So let's get the coffee portion in here. Setting aside the feeding zone indicator briefly. Let's actually stick it off to the side with the top covering piece. And then I always like to sort of spread the coffee out a little bit. And then we'll take what's remaining of this interesting concoction and sprinkle it down into the coffee. So I'm definitely curious to see what becomes of this stuff. I was very tempted to just fill this thing up with water and let that stuff all suck water into itself and make it all nice and damp. And then kind of feed it as sort of a goop or as like a sticky, starchy sort of treat. But it seemed to me like, you know what, let's just put it into the bin as is and let it hydrate there. And hopefully the worms will be able to make some good use of it in short order. The way it is right now, kind of dry, maybe not, but we almost forgot. Let's get this thing down here too. Keep it down where the action is so it can also benefit from worm action. Alright. And last but not least, before we get things covered up, we've got to deploy the worms from haul out number 3 and the conclusion of the cocoon nursery. So let's get them in here and then we could proceed to covering up and we'll be finished. Let's see here. So, like I usually do, I'm always turning to the audience to get their input on how many worms they think they saw. So, in the comments, I really ask that you just put in your guess, or your guesstimate, or what do you want to call your estimate for how many worms you think we're releasing into this system now, in addition to the the existing 716 that live in here already. And remember that 716 was also just an estimate based on everyone's input from previous haul outs and releases. So I'm just going to try to break them apart a little bit so we can better see them. Maybe we'll play the video back quickly so we can also see some movement that would otherwise be difficult to see. And then we'll cover up and we'll be finished. I thought I'd come back in here really quick just to see if I can give myself a slightly better sense of how many worms we're actually releasing here by seeing if I can grab a couple of these larger pieces of material that we pulled out of the bait stations. See if we can kind of unwrap them to see if it reveals extra worms. So here, for example, I opened this piece of cardboard up. It had 3 worms hiding in it. Here's another piece of sort of folded over piece of newspaper. See, here too, another half a dozen little wormies in there, some of them really tiny. So I wanted to just get that extra little sense of what's going on in this haul out and worm release, just so I can kind of dial my estimate in to be realistic. Because sometimes you see a bunch of worms, but then you also have to assume that a great number of them are just sort of like here too, tucked away within the folds of a piece of cardboard or paper. So I think I'm starting to get a slightly better estimate, a slightly larger number in my head now, just from getting a better understanding of what I'm seeing and what I'm not seeing. And the simple fact that I know that a lot of what I released in here was just worms I didn't even see. So, all right, that's it. Make sure I don't have any wormies on my glove. There, we can get things covered up. So it's always kind of a good, sort of sense of accomplishment when you finally bring closure to a in-progress system that's got sort of a mission like that cocoon nursery had. And it was kind of a long time in the making, because when you've got yourself a batch of castings and there's cocoons in it, you're gonna have to wait for the cocoons to hatch, wait for the babies to get big enough and mobile enough to be rounded up, and then take the time to round them up and all that other fun stuff. So it is kind of a big unknown in terms of how long it's going to take, but when it finally gets to the finish line, it is kind of rewarding. So that's it for our check-in with the now completed Red Wiggler Cocoon Nursery, as well as a quick feeding of some unusual stuff from my 2 newest Red Wiggler bins, as well as an injection of some additional worms. Please don't forget to add your contribution of your estimate of how many worms we just added to the system. Then I'll be tallying up the numbers, and that'll be the final load of worms into here as far as the population goes. So let me get myself cleaned up and get things put away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.